In case you've been living under a rock, Nintendo has managed to set off one of the loudest firestorms in gaming this year, and not in a good way. What started as a single lawsuit against the team behind Poworld has now spiraled into something much bigger. We're talking about a potential new era of lawsuits in the gaming industry, where billion-dollar companies start swinging legal hammers at anything that feels even remotely similar to their own products. And here's the kicker. It's not just Nintendo doing this. Sony has jumped into the fray too, targeting another game in a way that feels eerily similar. And if both of these cases move forward the way these publishers hope, the future of creative game development could be in serious trouble. Now, before you think this is just another Nintendo bad rant, let me be clear. What's happening here is more than just Nintendo being overly protective of its brand. This isn't just about Pokémon or one indie developer. This is about setting a precedent that could reshape how games are made, marketed, and even imagined in the first place. It's about whether inspiration is still allowed in game design, or if every visual similarity and gameplay mechanic is going to get dragged into court. And if that sounds dramatic, good. Because the truth is, it is dramatic, and the ripple effects could be enormous. Let's set the stage. Poworld, the game that instantly exploded in popularity earlier this year, sold over 10 million copies in a matter of weeks. It dominated social media feeds, took over Twitch streams, and had a player base that wasn't just big, it was obsessive. Part Pokémon, part survival shooter, part crafting sim, it hit a sweet spot that even the Pokémon franchise hasn't quite reached in years. And maybe that's the problem. You see, when a small team like Pocket Pair, a studio operating on a fraction of Nintendo's budget, drops a hit that starts to threaten the cultural dominance of one of Nintendo's crown jewels, the corporate panic button gets smashed. And in Nintendo's case, they didn't just smash it, they basically welded it in place. Nintendo's lawsuit isn't even centered on creature designs, which is what most casual observers assumed. No, the main accusations are over game mechanics. Specifically, the idea that Poworld's capture devices are too close to Poké Balls. And, this is the weird one, that Nintendo somehow owns the right to riding your creatures as transportation. Yes, apparently riding a fictional animal is something Nintendo believes only they can legally do. It sounds ridiculous, but in the black and white world of legal arguments, that's enough for them to take it to court. And if they win on those grounds, you can bet that hundreds of other games could suddenly be illegal overnight. But here's where it gets interesting, and also more alarming. Around the same time Nintendo was gearing up to hit Pocket Pair with their lawsuit, Sony went after a completely different game with a strikingly similar playbook. The game in question, Light of Motum. At first glance, you could be forgiven for mistaking its reveal trailer for a Horizon spin-off. It's got the red-haired protagonist. It's got the bows and spears. It's got a lush post-apocalyptic world crawling with robotic dinosaurs. Even the way the light hits the characters, the way the robots' eyes glow, the animations, all of it screams Horizon Zero Dawn. And Sony noticed. Oh, did they notice? They didn't just call it similar. They outright accused Light of Motum of being a slavish clone of Horizon. In their lawsuit, they're seeking $150,000 in damages. And here's the extreme part, all copies and materials for the game so they can destroy them. And in case you think that's just corporate bluster, remember, this isn't an indie studio they're fighting. Light of Motum is published by Tencent, a company with more money and influence than most governments. Tencent can fight back hard. But that's the exact difference between these two cases. Nintendo targeted a much smaller, less equipped opponent, while Sony is going toe-to-toe with a giant that can actually afford to push back. So why start here, with two seemingly unrelated lawsuits? Because they are not unrelated, they're two sides of the same coin. Major publishers trying to legally secure their territory by treating certain genres, mechanics, and aesthetics as if they own them. It's not just about protecting a brand, it's about scaring off competitors before they can get too big. And if they succeed, it's not just the studios in their crosshairs right now that should be worried, it's everyone. The scary part is, this strategy has worked before. Nintendo, in particular, has a long history of aggressively shutting down fan games, mods, and even charity events if they use Nintendo's intellectual property without permission. Just recently, they forced a Japanese speedrunning event, the kind meant to raise money for Doctors Without Borders no less, to remove Nintendo games from their lineup. And their reasoning was simple. No prior permission was given, so it's unauthorized. It doesn't matter that the event was for charity. It doesn't matter that people stream Nintendo games every single day on Twitch and YouTube without consequence. If Nintendo wants to pull the plug, they will. That's why these two lawsuits matter. Because while Tencent might have the war chest to fight Sony and Pocket Pair might squeeze out a defense against Nintendo, the precedent set here will linger. And if the precedent is, big companies can sue over vague similarities in gameplay or art direction, then suddenly the walls close in on every creative team in the industry. Your game doesn't even have to look like a competitor's. If it just feels too similar in the eyes of their lawyers, that could be enough to get it pulled from stores. And that's where this whole thing shifts from being about Poworld or Light of Motum to being about the future of game development itself. Because at the end of the day, no game exists in a vacuum. Every mechanic, every piece of art, every concept is inspired by something else. It's been this way since the first pixel was drawn on a screen. But if the current legal climate keeps moving in this direction, we might be watching the start of an industry where inspiration is treated as theft, and where only the most risk-averse formulaic ideas survive. Let's talk about Poworld, the game that Nintendo apparently saw in their nightmares, woke up sweating, and immediately called their lawyers about. If you somehow missed the chaos when this game dropped, here's the short version. Poworld exploded onto the scene with a formula that felt fresh but familiar. You had a massive open world to explore, creatures to capture, survival mechanics, crafting systems, and yes, you could shoot guns. Real guns. In a game that looked like Pokemon but acted like ARK Survival Evolved after a triple espresso. It wasn't just a minor hit, it was the hit for weeks on end. Over 10 million copies sold faster than Nintendo could blink, Twitch streams hitting record numbers, memes flooding every corner of social media. For an indie developer like Pocket Pair, this was a once-in-a-lifetime breakout. For Nintendo, it was a red alert, all-hands-on-deck situation. Because from their perspective, here was a game that was not only attracting Pokemon fans, but actually making them question why they were still playing Pokemon at all. And that's the kind of threat you don't ignore when your entire brand leans on one of the most recognizable gaming franchises in history. But here's where it gets interesting. Nintendo's lawsuit against Pocket Pair isn't about the creatures themselves. Most of them look different enough to avoid an easy copyright claim. The real fight is over mechanics. The first major point, the way players capture creatures in Poworld. In Nintendo's view, those capsules are too close to Poké Balls, even though legally speaking, you can't copyright a sphere with a button any more than you can copyright a stick in a fighting game. But that's the hill Nintendo's decided to die on, the idea that a container for capturing monsters in a game belongs to them. The second point is even weirder. Nintendo claims they own the idea of riding your captured creatures for transportation. You heard that right. If you tame a fictional animal and use it as a mount, Nintendo believes you're trespassing on their intellectual property. Which, if you think about it for more than 10 seconds, makes no sense. By that logic, World of Warcraft, Monster Hunter, and Final Fantasy XIV should all be on Nintendo's legal hit list. But the way these lawsuits work isn't about what makes sense. It's about what you can convince a judge or jury to see as substantially similar to your own IP. From a business standpoint, Nintendo's move makes a kind of cold, calculated sense. Pocket Pair is small. They don't have the war chest of a Tencent or a Microsoft. They can't tie Nintendo up in court for years without bleeding money. So even if Nintendo doesn't have an airtight case, the mere threat of an expensive legal battle might be enough to push Pocket Pair into a settlement or even pull certain features from the game. It's not just about winning in court, it's about making the fight so expensive that the other side can't afford to keep swinging. But this is where Nintendo's strategy starts to look less like protecting their brand and more like policing a genre. Because if they succeed here, it's not just Poworld that's at risk. Any future game with monster collecting, capsule-based capture devices, or even rideable creatures could be on the chopping block. And if you think that sounds extreme, remember, Nintendo has a long history of going after even the smallest fan projects. We've seen them shut down fan-made Pokémon MMOs, cancel Metroid remakes, and take down Mario mods that weren't even being sold for profit. They've built a reputation for being one of the most aggressive IP enforcers in the industry. One of the most telling examples happened recently in Japan. A speedrunning charity event, think games done quick, but raising money for Doctors Without Borders, planned to showcase several Nintendo titles. Harmless, right? Wrong. Nintendo stepped in and demanded that all their games be removed from the lineup because the event hadn't asked for permission ahead of time. It didn't matter that this was a charity. It didn't matter that the games would be played in a way that promoted Nintendo's own products. The answer was simply no. And the event organizers had no choice but to comply. Now, apply that same mindset to Poworld. Nintendo doesn't care that the game isn't a direct Pokémon clone. They don't care that the art style, combat, and tone are different. What they care about is control. The control to decide who's allowed to make a game with even a passing resemblance to their own work. And in this case, they've decided Pocket Pair's too close for comfort. But here's the part Nintendo probably didn't anticipate: public perception. Since news of the lawsuit broke, the internet has been overwhelmingly critical of Nintendo's move. Gamers see Poworld not as a cheap knockoff, but as an exciting alternative to a Pokémon formula that many feel has grown stale. Instead of innovating on their own series, Nintendo is spending its time and money trying to shut down the competition. And that's never a good look, especially when the competitor is a smaller studio that just pulled off the impossible, stealing the spotlight from one of the most profitable franchises on Earth. On top of that, the lawsuit has had the opposite effect of what Nintendo probably wanted. Instead of slowing Poworld down, it's given the game even more exposure. People who had never heard of it before are now curious. Sales have stayed strong. The community is doubling down on its support, rallying behind Pocket Pair like they're the underdog in a sports movie. And while Nintendo can still cause them a lot of headaches in court, they can't stop the goodwill and momentum that Poworld has built. Here's the reality. This case isn't really about a Poké Ball lookalike or riding creatures. Those are just the hooks Nintendo's lawyers are using to frame the argument. The real issue is whether big companies can claim ownership over ideas that have been part of gaming for decades. Because if the court sides with Nintendo here, it's a green light for them and other publishers to start carving out entire genres as their exclusive property. That's a dangerous precedent, not just for game developers, but for players too. Because fewer competitors means fewer choices, less innovation, and ultimately a worse industry for everyone. And while Pocket Pair may be small, they've got one thing Nintendo doesn't: the court of public opinion firmly on their side. In an age where community support can make or break a game's long-term success, that might be just as valuable as a legal victory. While Nintendo is busy going after a smaller indie dev, Sony has decided to swing at a giant, and they've picked a fight with one of the most powerful gaming companies in the world, Tencent. And the game at the center of it all? Light of Motum. If you haven't seen it yet, imagine you're watching a brand new Horizon game trailer. You've got sprawling landscapes that look straight out of a post-apocalyptic nature documentary. You've got hulking mechanical beasts roaming the wild. You've got a red-haired protagonist with a bow and spear, moving with the same kind of fluid animations Guerrilla Games spent years perfecting for Horizon, Zero Dawn, and Horizon Forbidden West. Even the lighting, the way it glints off metal, the way lens flares catch the edges of armor, feels like you've been dropped right back into Aloy's world. Except, it's not a Horizon game. It's Light of Motum, an original title being developed and published by Tencent. And the similarities aren't just casual. Sony's lawsuit claims the game is a slavish clone of the Horizon series. They're not just asking for damages. They're asking for $150,000 and all copies and materials of the game so they can destroy them. Think about that. Sony doesn't just want to win in court, they want this game wiped off the face of the earth as if it never existed. From Sony's perspective, the case is obvious. Horizon is their crown jewel in the open-world action genre, and Light of Motum is too close for comfort. It's got the robotic dinosaur aesthetic, the near-identical weaponry, the similar costume design for its human characters, and even the same natural world overtaken by machine life theme. On paper, it's almost tailor-made to trigger every alarm a corporate legal team could have. But here's where this case diverges massively from Nintendo versus Poworld. Tencent is not Pocket Pair. Tencent isn't a scrappy indie hoping for one breakout hit to survive another year. Tencent is one of the richest, most powerful companies in the gaming industry, with stakes in everything from League of Legends to Call of Duty to Fortnite. They own Riot Games outright. They own Supercell. They have investments in Epic Games, Activision, Blizzard, Ubisoft. The list goes on. And more importantly, Tencent has the money, the lawyers, and the stubbornness to go toe-to-toe with Sony without breaking a sweat. That alone changes the dynamic. Nintendo's strategy with Poworld relies heavily on the assumption that Pocket Pair doesn't have the resources to fight forever. Sony, on the other hand, knows Tencent can match them punch for punch, which means this case is less about intimidation and more about making a statement. Don't try to ride our coattails, even if you think you can afford the ride. Now, here's the twist that really makes this lawsuit messy. According to Sony's complaint, they actually turned down an offer from Tencent to collaborate on a new Horizon game last year. Fast forward a few months, and Tencent suddenly announces Light of Motum, a game that just so happens to share key gameplay systems, themes, and aesthetics with Horizon. From Sony's angle, this looks like they said no to a partnership, and Tencent essentially went, "Fine, we'll make our own Horizon." And legally, that's a very dangerous look. Does that mean Sony automatically has the upper hand? Not exactly. Because while Light of Motum clearly borrows heavily from Horizon's visual and thematic DNA, the gameplay space it's operating in isn't unique to Sony. Hunting massive creatures with ranged and melee weapons? That's Monster Hunter. Open-world traversal through lush, dangerous environments? That's been a staple of dozens of games for decades. Even robotic enemies aren't something Sony invented. Just ask fans of Xenoblade Chronicles X or Enslaved: Odyssey to the West. The question becomes, at what point does inspiration cross into infringement? And more importantly, who gets to decide that? Because if Sony wins this case, it's not just Horizon they're protecting, it's the entire aesthetic and gameplay loop they've cultivated. Suddenly, any game with a red-haired archer in a robot-infested wilderness could be in legal danger. This is where the parallels to Nintendo versus Poworld really start to stand out. In both cases, the big publisher isn't accusing the smaller party of straight-up copying code or assets. They're accusing them of copying ideas. And ideas are tricky things to lock down in court. The law generally protects specific expressions of an idea, like exact art assets, scripts, or character models, not the broad concept itself. That's why you can have 2 movies about meteor strikes, 2 books about wizards in schools, or 2 games about shooting aliens without lawsuits flying every time. But Sony's case does have one unique wrinkle. Horizon's art direction is extremely distinct. The combination of tribal-inspired clothing, high-tech weaponry, and dinosaur-like machines isn't something you see every day. That gives Sony's lawyers a stronger position to argue that Light of Motum isn't just similar in a genre sense, it's imitating Horizon's signature identity. And if they can convince a court of that, Tencent's in for a long fight. Still, Tencent is far from helpless here. They can argue that Horizon itself borrows from other games, namely Monster Hunter, which features targeted attacks to break off monster parts for crafting, and Far Cry, Primal, which blends primitive weaponry with an open-world survival loop. They can point to other examples of robot enemies, post-apocalyptic settings, and female protagonists in similar attire. The more they can show that Horizon's building blocks are shared across the industry, the harder it becomes for Sony to claim sole ownership over them. And that's why this case matters far beyond Horizon or Light of Motum. If Sony can establish that a combination of ideas, not just the individual parts, can be treated as proprietary, then a lot of developers are going to have to think twice before making anything that even feels like an existing hit. That's the same chilling effect Nintendo's lawsuit threatens to create in the monster collecting space. The big difference? The power balance. If Sony wins against Tencent, it's not because they steamrolled a weaker opponent, it's because they actually convinced a court that a certain mix of aesthetics and mechanics is off limits. And if that happens, it will be a green light for other LAA publishers to start claiming similar ownership over their own formulas. Which is exactly why these two cases, though aimed at very different targets, feel like they're part of the same storm. One's a David versus Goliath fight, the other's a clash of titans. But both are testing the same dangerous question: how much of a game can be inspired before it becomes illegal? On paper, you might think the Sony versus Light of Motum fight would be the higher stakes legal battle. It's two industry heavyweights going at each other with billions of dollars in resources between them. But if you look closer, the more precarious situation might actually be the one Nintendo's target is in: Pocket Pair and their surprise hit, Poworld. And the reason is simple: resources. Pocket Pair isn't broke by any means. Poworld sold over 10 million copies, which is a massive win for an indie studio. But that revenue doesn't instantly turn you into a global powerhouse. You still have overhead ongoing development costs, and now the looming shadow of a legal battle with one of the most notoriously aggressive IP enforcers in the gaming industry. Nintendo, on the other hand, has decades of cash reserves, a legal team that's been battle-hardened from shutting down countless fan projects, and a reputation for outlasting opponents until they either fold or settle. They don't have to win quickly. They just have to keep the fight going long enough for the other side to run out of oxygen. And that's what makes this case far riskier for Pocket Pair than Tencent's situation with Sony. Tencent can go blow for blow with Sony's legal budget indefinitely. Even if Sony dragged this out for 5 years, Tencent could treat the legal costs as a rounding error. Pocket Pair. They'd feel every invoice, every hour billed, every delay in court. That's why Nintendo's strategy makes sense from a cold business standpoint. You don't pick fights with opponents who can match you. You go after the ones who can't. But the financial imbalance isn't the only reason Poworld might be in more danger. The specific claims Nintendo is making, while strange on the surface, are actually crafted to target areas where they think they can make something stick. The Poké Ball-like capture device is an obvious one. Even though a sphere with a button is hardly a unique concept, Nintendo can argue that in the context of a monster-catching game, the visual and functional similarities are too close to ignore. If they can convince a judge or jury that this specific combination of design and gameplay is strongly associated with Pokémon, they don't need to prove exact copying, just that the average person would see it and immediately think Pokémon. That's a much lower bar than proving a literal clone. The creature writing claim is even more bizarre, but here's the catch. It's not about writing animals in general. It's about writing captured creatures that you've caught in a game that already borrows heavily from Pokémon's structure. Nintendo's lawyers will frame this as another unique element of Pokémon's gameplay loop that Poworld has appropriated. And while you and I might think that's absurd, given how many games have mounts, remember, the courtroom isn't about what's absurd. It's about what you can argue with a straight face and back up with enough precedent to sway the decision. The bigger danger here is precedent. If Nintendo wins, they set a legal standard that could be used against any future game in the monster collecting genre. Imagine a future where no developer can create a game with capture devices, leveling systems for creatures, or creature writing mechanics without Nintendo's blessing. That's not just bad news for indie devs, that's a chilling effect on the entire creative side of the industry. And history shows Nintendo is not afraid to keep pushing once they've scored a win. They've gone after fan-made Pokemon MMO projects even when they were free. ROM hosting sites suing for tens of millions in damages, YouTube channels showing Nintendo game footage without authorization, charity events like the Japanese speedrun marathon for Doctors Without Borders simply because they didn't get permission ahead of time. That last one is particularly telling because it shows Nintendo's enforcement isn't about profit loss, it's about control. Even when the use of their games would only help their public image, they still shut it down because it wasn't on their terms. That same mindset is what fuels this lawsuit against Poké Pair. It's less, you stole from us, and more, you dared to play in our sandbox without permission. Now, contrast that with Sony's situation against Tencent. Sony can make a compelling case about Light of Motum copying Horizon's art style and identity. But Tencent is a fortress. Even if Sony won in court, Tencent could afford to appeal, drag the process out, and even keep developing the game in the meantime. For Poké Pair, just surviving the process is the battle. And there's another brutal reality. Public opinion doesn't stop lawsuits. Yes, Nintendo's getting roasted online for this. Yes, gamers see Poké Pair as the underdog hero. But public support doesn't pay legal bills, and it doesn't carry weight in court filings. Nintendo knows this. Their legal strategy is to make the process itself the punishment. If Poké Pair caves, even without a verdict, Nintendo still wins by removing a threat and setting an example to other would-be competitors. The only wildcard here is that Poworld is, in many ways, different enough from Pokémon to avoid a clear-cut infringement ruling. It's more of a third-person shooter with survival and crafting mechanics, and its tone is wildly different from Pokémon's kid-friendly approach. Those differences could be enough for Poké Pair to argue that Nintendo's claims are overreaching. But winning that argument will take time, expert witnesses, and a legal team that can hold the line without draining the company's war chest. And that's where the danger really lies. Even if Poké Pair is confident they'll win, can they afford the years-long grind it will take to get there? Or will Nintendo's endless resources simply wear them down until they take a settlement that forces them to alter the game in ways that make it less appealing? If that happens, it's not just a loss for Poké Pair, it's a signal to the rest of the industry that challenging a giant like Nintendo isn't worth it, no matter how strong your case might be. And once that signal's out there, the chilling effect kicks in fast. Smaller studios will steer clear of certain genres entirely, not because they're worried about losing in court, but because they can't afford to even go to court. So while the headlines might make Sony versus Tencent sound like the bigger, flashier clash, it's Nintendo versus Poké Pair that could have the more immediate and damaging impact on the industry. If Nintendo wins here, it will embolden other publishers to start targeting mechanics, aesthetics, and gameplay loops that were previously considered fair game. And if you think that's far-fetched, just remember, if this exact mindset had been applied in the past, entire genres might never have existed. No Dark Souls because Zelda owns action-adventure. No Fortnite because PUBG owns Battle Royale. No Call of Duty because Medal of Honor owns military shooters. That's the road we're walking toward if this lawsuit succeeds. To really understand why Nintendo's going after Poworld so aggressively, you have to look at their history. Because this isn't a one-off move. This is part of a pattern, a decades-long habit of guarding their IP so tightly that sometimes it doesn't just look defensive, it looks downright hostile to the very people who keep their brand alive. Nintendo's corporate DNA has always been about control. Control of their hardware, their software, their licensing, and most importantly, their image. In their eyes, anything that uses their IP without explicit permission is a threat. And that applies whether you're a billion-dollar competitor or a hobbyist making something in your bedroom. One of the clearest examples happened just recently with the Japanese speedrunning event that was supposed to benefit Doctors Without Borders. Think of it like games done quick, but focused on a Japanese audience. The event had a lineup of games from all over the industry, including several Nintendo titles. Nothing shady, no piracy. just skilled players showing off games they loved, games that, by the way, they had purchased. But Nintendo stepped in and shut it down. Why? Because the organizers hadn't asked for permission to stream Nintendo's games in advance. It didn't matter that the event was for charity. It didn't matter that showcasing these games would probably boost their sales and brand recognition. The only thing that mattered was that it happened without Nintendo's blessing. This same my way or the highway mentality has shown up again and again. Fan projects shut down, ROM sites sued into oblivion, YouTube videos with Nintendo game footage hit with takedown notices, even harmless mods that add Mario to a completely different game. Gone. And here's the thing, Nintendo isn't wrong in a legal sense. They have every right to protect their intellectual property. But the way they go about it often alienates the very people who are most passionate about their work. In an age where most companies understand the value of community goodwill, Nintendo seems to be playing from a playbook written in the 1980s. The irony is that Nintendo's most passionate fans are also the ones who tend to push creative boundaries. They're the ones making fan games, speedrunning, modding, and remixing content. These aren't people trying to destroy Nintendo's brand. They're keeping it alive between official releases. But to Nintendo, intent doesn't matter. If you didn't get permission, it's unauthorized, and if it's unauthorized, it's a target. This mindset is exactly what's fueling their case against Pocket Pair. To Nintendo, Poworld isn't just a game that looks like it borrows a few ideas from Pokémon. It's an example of what happens when someone operates in their creative territory without permission. And while the lawsuit is technically about specific mechanics, capture devices, creature riding, the underlying message is the same. If you want to play in our space, you either do it with us or you don't do it at all. It's also worth noting that Nintendo has never really had to deal with a serious competitor in the monster collecting space before. Sure, games like Temtem have popped up, but none have had the cultural explosion of Poworld. For the first time in decades, another title in this niche is actually making people choose between playing it and playing Pokémon. That's a threat Nintendo can't ignore, and they're not the only ones thinking this way. Sony's lawsuit against Light of Motum is driven by a similar philosophy: protect the flagship franchise at all costs. But while Sony is aiming at a corporate heavyweight like Tencent, Nintendo is punching down. They're using their legal muscle to squeeze a smaller developer, one who, even after selling millions of copies, doesn't have the resources to fight forever. The danger here isn't just that Nintendo might win. It's that this aggressive posture becomes the norm for how big publishers respond to competition. Once the precedent is set, others will follow. Capcom could decide that Monster Hunter-style combat belongs to them alone. From Software could decide that the Souls-like genre is their exclusive property. Rockstar could decide that no other studio is allowed to make an open-world crime game. And if you think that sounds extreme, remember, we're already seeing the groundwork being laid. This isn't about clones stealing entire games wholesale. It's about claiming ownership over ideas and formulas. Nintendo claims monster capturing and creature riding. Sony claims robotic dinosaur hunting. The next publisher might claim crafting survival hybrids. Where does it end? What makes Nintendo's situation even more frustrating is that they've shown, in certain rare cases, that they can be flexible. Look at how they've collaborated with Ubisoft on Mario plus Rabbids. Look at how they've allowed LEGO to create sets based on their characters. They're perfectly willing to share the sandbox when they control the terms and the money. But the moment someone tries to build their own castle in that sandbox without Nintendo's oversight, the bulldozers come out. The real tragedy here is that this kind of aggressive IP protection doesn't just stifle competition, it stifles creativity. Because when developers start second-guessing whether their mechanics, art style, or even themes might trigger a lawsuit, they start playing it safe. And safe games rarely push the industry forward. That's why the Poworld case matters so much. It's not just about one game. It's about whether Nintendo, and by extension other big publishers, can successfully redraw the boundaries of what's allowed in gaming. If they win, those boundaries get smaller. The list of safe ideas gets shorter, and the number of studios willing to take risks in certain genres shrinks dramatically. So when people say Nintendo is just protecting their IP, they're technically right. But when you zoom out, it starts to look less like protection and more like preemptive territory control. They're not just guarding the castle, they're trying to own the entire countryside. And if that mindset keeps spreading, we could be looking at an industry where innovation only happens when a giant gives you the green light. If you strip away the legal arguments and the PR spin, the core question behind both the Poworld and Light of Motum lawsuits is this: when does inspiration become theft? And that's not just a tricky question. It's one the gaming industry has been dancing around for decades, because the truth is, every game you've ever played owes something to the games that came before it. Mechanics, themes, visual styles, even specific enemy types, they all get passed along, remixed, and reimagined. If we treated borrowing as a crime, the entire history of gaming would be one giant case file. Let's start with one of the most famous examples: Berserk and the Soulsborne games. Hidetaka Miyazaki, the director behind Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring, has never hidden the fact that the long-running manga Berserk was a huge influence on his work. And it shows everywhere. Look at the armor designs in Dark Souls. You've got Millennia's helmet in Elden Ring that's nearly a dead ringer for a Berserk character. You've got characters striking iconic guts poses. You've got enemy types that are almost one-to-one recreations of creatures in the manga. The Taurus demon, certain dragon designs, even snake-headed humanoids. In Dark Souls 2, there's an enemy type that looks suspiciously like it walked straight out of Berserk's pages. And it doesn't stop there. Shadow of the Erdtree's Mesmer wears a helmet eerily similar to Berserk's Dragon Knights, the giant wicker man enemies, straight out of Berserk. Even the mood, that dark, tragic medieval fantasy tone, feels like a love letter to Kentaro Miura's work. By the logic Nintendo and Sony are using now, Miura's estate could be filing lawsuits left and right against From Software. But that hasn't happened, and for good reason. These are homages. Miyazaki isn't just copying designs, he's transforming them, weaving them into a new world with new mechanics and stories. Inspiration is the fuel, but the final product is its own machine. And Miyazaki himself has openly talked about this. When comparisons were made between Dark Souls and The Legend of Zelda, he didn't get defensive. In an interview nearly a decade ago, he called Zelda monumental and admitted it served as a sort of textbook for 3D action games. He even said he felt unworthy of the comparison. That humility tells you everything. Great designers know they're standing on the shoulders of giants. This same pattern plays out across the entire industry. First-person shooters exploded after Doom, but Doom itself was built on ideas from earlier shooters like Wolfenstein 3D. Fortnite took PUBG's Battle Royale formula and made it mainstream, but PUBG itself was inspired by mods for Arma 2 and H1Z1. Halo was hailed as a revolutionary console shooter, but its core mechanics, recharging shields, 2-weapon limits, vehicle combat, were all evolutions of ideas from older PC games. Even Horizon Zero Dawn, the very game Sony is now defending in court, owes a huge debt to Capcom's Monster Hunter series. In both games, you target specific monster parts to break them off, harvest them, and craft better gear. The only real difference is that Horizon's monsters are robotic instead of organic. Should Capcom have sued Guerrilla Games over that, or take open-world crime games? If Rockstar had decided that Grand Theft Auto was their formula, Ubisoft could never have made Watch Dogs, Volition could never have made Saints Row, and CD Projekt Red couldn't have made Cyberpunk 2077. Imagine how much smaller and more boring the industry would be if those games didn't exist just because the core loop was too similar to GTA. The point here is that inspiration and iteration are how the medium evolves. Every major innovation in gaming history, from 3D platformers to loot shooters, started with someone taking an existing idea and adding their own twist. If we start treating those twists as illegal, unless they're completely unrelated to what came before, we kill the very process that creates new genres in the first place. And this is what makes the Poworld and Light of Motum lawsuits so dangerous. They're not about preventing the theft of unique code or original characters. They're about staking legal claims over combinations of ideas and aesthetics that have always been fluid in gaming. Now, let's be clear. There is a line. Directly ripping art assets, copying code, or reproducing entire scripts without permission is theft. That's not inspiration, that's duplication. But neither Poworld nor Light of Motum is accused of doing that. They're accused of making games that feel too much like an existing hit. And feel is a slippery thing to legislate. If you take the logic behind these lawsuits to its extreme, the absurdities pile up fast. Nintendo wins against Poworld. Now they can go after Temtem, Coromon, and any other monster capturing game with spherical capture devices. Sony wins against Light of Motum. Now they can target any open-world game with bow-wielding protagonists and large mechanical enemies. Capcom sees Sony win, decides to claim ownership over the Hunt monster, break parts, craft gear loop, forcing changes in dozens of games. From Software sees that precedent, decides no other studio can make a game where death resets your progress, but enemies respawn. You see how quickly it spirals. Once you start saying this genre-defining feature belongs to us, you open the door for everyone to start carving up the creative commons of gaming, until nothing is left that's safe to use. And that's the irony. A world where these lawsuits succeed isn't a world with less copying. It's a world with fewer games, period. Because studios won't risk spending millions on a project that could be shut down halfway through development because it shares a mechanic with something already out there. The safest option becomes making sequels, remakes, and reboots of existing IPs. And we're already seeing enough of that without adding legal fear into the mix. History shows that great games often come from risky blends of familiar and new. Minecraft combined survival crafting with voxel worlds. The Witcher 3 mixed traditional RPG storytelling with open-world exploration. Elden Ring fused Souls-like combat with true open-world freedom. None of those games invented their individual pieces, but they made something magical by putting them together in a way nobody had before. If lawsuits start cutting off that kind of experimentation, we all lose. Not just developers, but players too. If there's one thing the Poworld and Light of Motum cases prove, it's that once a company finds a legal angle that works, they're not going to use it just once. They'll use it again and again, and other companies will copy the tactic. That's the real danger here. Not just that Nintendo might win against Pocket Pair, or that Sony might win against Tencent, but that a victory in either case becomes a precedent. A precedent that says, if you can convince a court that a game's mechanics or aesthetic identity are yours, you can shut it down. Once that door's open, every big publisher with a valuable IP will be asking the same question. What parts of our games could we claim as proprietary? Let's play this out. Say Nintendo beats Pocket Pair. The court agrees that Pokeball-like capture devices and riding captured creatures are too closely tied to Pokemon's identity to be used without permission. What happens next? Suddenly, Temtem, Coromon, and any other monster collecting game using a similar loop become easy targets. Even if their capture devices are shaped differently, Nintendo could argue that the function is still the same. And function tied to a brand identity is exactly what they just won on. Smaller studios see the writing on the wall and abandon monster-catching concepts entirely. Now let's say Sony beats Tencent. The court decides that the combination of a red-haired female protagonist, robotic dinosaur enemies, and a tribal meets futuristic art style is distinctive enough to belong to Horizon. This ruling doesn't just hit Light of Motum. Any studio working on an open-world game with similar aesthetics suddenly has to rethink everything from their character designs to their enemy roster. Ubisoft has to tweak a Far Cry spin-off. CD Projekt Red scraps a sci-fi prototype. Smaller studios don't even bother trying. because who's going to risk getting Horizon's lawyers on the phone? Once these two wins are on the books, other publishers start asking their lawyers to draw up their own signature combinations for protection. Capcom could claim the Hunt Monster Break Parts, Craft Gear loop is Monster Hunter's proprietary gameplay. From Software could try to lock down the death to respawn to enemy reset loop of Souls-like games. Rockstar could say open-world urban crime games with wanted levels and radio stations are GTA's domain. Blizzard could argue that team-based hero shooters with ultimates are Overwatch's exclusive territory. And here's the scary part. These claims wouldn't even have to hold up in court to be effective. Just the threat of a lawsuit is often enough to make a smaller developer back down or change direction. It's the same reason so many indie teams abandon projects after a cease and desist letter. Even if they could win, they can't afford to fight. Once publishers realize they can cordon off chunks of gaming like this, creativity takes a nosedive. Studios stop experimenting with new blends of mechanics or aesthetics because the risk is too high. Instead, they retreat to safe zones, making sequels, remakes, and minor variations of existing IPs. We've seen what that kind of industry looks like before. The early 2000s and 10s were notorious for the Call of Duty-ification of shooters. Every publisher wanted their own military FPS with iron sights and XP unlocks because that's what was selling. The result? A glut of near-identical games that blurred together until players got tired and moved on. Now, imagine that, but across every genre, not because of market trends, but because of legal fear. To really drive home how absurd this could get, let's stretch the logic even further. Bethesda wins a case saying open-world RPG with first-person perspective belongs to the Elder Scrolls. Goodbye, Outer Worlds. Goodbye, Cyberpunk 2077. Mojang claims voxel-based building games are Minecraft's property. Say farewell to Terraria, Dragon Quest Builders, and LEGO Worlds. EA claims the ultimate team card pack mechanic belongs to FIFA. No more card-based team modes in other sports games. Even Tetris once tried, and failed, to block other block-dropping puzzle games. Imagine if that had succeeded. No Doctor. Mario, no Puyo Puyo Tetris. It sounds ridiculous, until you remember that Nintendo's currently arguing they own the right to ride fictional animals you've captured. Once that's on the table, everything else suddenly feels possible. Here's the part that often gets lost. This isn't just a developer problem. If these lawsuits succeed, players lose too. Not just in the obvious fewer games to choose from way, but in the long-term effect it has on innovation. That weird new game you fall in love with? The one that mashes up mechanics you've never seen combined before? It probably wouldn't exist in a post-precedent industry. The legal minefield would scare it out of existence before it ever reached you. And the games that do get made, they'll be safer, blander, and more predictable. Because when the only greenlit projects are ones 100% free of potential infringement, you're left with the lowest risk ideas, sequels, remasters, spin-offs of existing IPs. It's easy to think, well, that's worst-case scenario. It'll never get that bad. But we've already seen early warning signs. The PUBG Corp lawsuit against Epic Games over Fortnite's Battle Royale mode in 2018 was an early test of this kind of mechanics ownership claim. Candy Crush developer King once tried to trademark the word saga, threatening other games with that word in their title. Zynga aggressively pursued other mobile devs for making too similar farm simulation games in the wake of Farmville's success. Those cases didn't all succeed, but each one was a step toward normalizing the idea that you can fence off game concepts. If Nintendo or Sony land a big win here, that normalization accelerates. And here's the twist. If this kind of thinking really took over, it could even backfire on the companies pushing it. Imagine a future where they want to explore a new genre, but another publisher claims the signature elements of that genre are already theirs. Suddenly, the trap they built for others becomes their own prison. Now that we've dug through the details of both the Poworld and Light of Motum lawsuits, it's time to ask the big question. What actually happens next? Because while it's tempting to imagine both of these ending in some cinematic courtroom climax where one side is decisively crushed, the reality of game industry lawsuits is usually much messier and far less satisfying. The most common ending for cases like this isn't a dramatic win or loss. It's a settlement. Both sides quietly agree to terms, nobody admits guilt, and the terms are either confidential or buried in vague PR language about mutually beneficial resolutions. For Nintendo versus Pocket Pair, that could mean Poworld stays up for sale, but with certain changes. Maybe the capture devices get redesigned, maybe the creature riding animations are tweaked. Nintendo gets to declare victory publicly, Pocket Pair avoids a financial death spiral, and the industry moves on, at least until the next lawsuit. For Sony versus Tencent, a settlement could take a different form. Given Tencent's size, Sony might negotiate for licensing fees or some form of collaboration. It's not crazy to imagine Light of Motum getting quietly rebranded and released under a co-published banner that gives Sony a slice of the revenue. In fact, there's precedent for this. Legal disputes over similar games have ended with one company buying publishing rights rather than forcing a complete shutdown. The upside of settlements is that the games survive. The downside, the legal arguments used to pressure those settlements don't go away, and neither does the chilling effect on other developers. If either company actually wins in court, the fallout is huge. Nintendo win. This sets a dangerous precedent that gameplay mechanics tied to a brand identity, like capture devices or riding captured creatures, can be treated as proprietary. Even if the ruling is narrowly worded, the ripple effect will be massive. Every monster collecting game in development will be audited for Pokémon overlap before it even gets past the concept stage. Sony winning a victory here would establish that a specific combination of aesthetics, narrative beats, and gameplay elements can be owned. That could lead to a wave of claims from other publishers looking to protect their own signature blends. This is where you start seeing genre-level lockdowns. Monster Hunter-style combat is ours, Souls-like progression is ours, and so on. Both wins would be touted as protecting originality in gaming. But in practice, they'd shrink the creative pool developers can draw from. It's also possible both companies lose, and honestly, that might be the best thing for the industry. Nintendo loss. If a court rules that Poworld's mechanics are too generic to be owned, it's a strong pushback against the idea of locking down gameplay loops. That would give smaller studios more confidence to explore genres without fear of being sued over functional similarities. Sony loss. If the court decides that Light of Motum is different enough from Horizon, it reinforces the standard that broad aesthetics and themes aren't protected unless they're near identical copies. This would make it harder for publishers to claim ownership over vibes or feel. The main downside of a loss? Big companies don't usually take it as a sign to stop. They just recalibrate, change their arguments, and try again later. Maybe with a different target or in a friendlier jurisdiction. Looking at both cases objectively, Nintendo versus Pocket Pair feels more likely to settle. Nintendo doesn't want to risk an outright loss that could weaken their ability to go after future infringers. Pocket Pair probably can't afford a multi-year legal slugfest. A mid-battle truce is the most realistic path. Sony versus Tencent has higher odds of going the distance. Tencent can afford to fight, and Sony's claim, while still risky, rests on more distinctive elements than Nintendo's. If either case produces a final public ruling, it's more likely to be this one. In the short term, both lawsuits already have an effect, even before any rulings are made. Smaller studios are watching these cases closely, and some are already adjusting their designs to avoid being the next Poworld or the next Light of Motum. Lawyers at big publishers are taking notes too, looking for ways to adapt these strategies for their own IPs. For players, that means some games might get stealth-changed mid-development, cutting or altering features that look too similar to protected titles. You'll never know those features existed, but they're gone just the same. If either lawsuit results in a big win, the long-term impact could reshape entire genres. Monster collecting games could dry up, reduced to officially licensed Pokémon spin-offs. Open-world Hunt the Big Creature games could become a lockdown club where only Capcom, Sony, or whoever wins control gets to participate. Even hybrid genres like Souls-like shooters or survival crafting RPGs could become riskier to attempt if the mechanical mashup resembles a protected combination. And it's not just about who can make a game, it's about who will. Investors are notoriously risk-averse. If there's even a chance a project might get sued into the ground, funding will disappear before the first prototype is built. Here's the funny, and by funny, I mean depressing, thing. If this legal strategy spreads too far, it could eventually backfire on the same companies pushing it. Imagine Nintendo, years from now, decides they want to branch out into a new genre. But another publisher has already secured a legal win, claiming that genre's core mechanics is their own signature. Suddenly, Nintendo's boxed out by the very precedent they helped create. The same goes for Sony. What if they want to make a Souls-like or a Monster Hunter competitor, but those formulas have been locked down by other publishers in the wake of Sony's Horizon win? That's the problem with turning game mechanics into legal property. Once you start fencing off the Creative Commons, you can't always control who owns the fences. At the end of the day, these two lawsuits, Nintendo versus Poworld and Sony versus Light of Motum, aren't really about Poké Balls, robotic dinosaurs, or who designed what first. They're about power. Who gets to decide what's too similar in an industry that's built on iteration, inspiration, and reinvention? And more importantly, who gets to keep making games when the line between inspired by and copied from becomes a moving target? For decades, gaming has thrived on that blurred line. Final Fantasy borrowed from Dragon Quest. Halo learned from GoldenEye. Fortnite took the Battle Royale formula from PUBG and made it bigger. Even the most innovative titles you can name, Minecraft, Breath of the Wild, Elden Ring, all stand on the shoulders of something that came before them. That's not theft. That's evolution. But if Nintendo or Sony or anyone else successfully argues that certain combinations of mechanics and aesthetics can be locked behind legal walls, that evolution slows to a crawl. Every genre becomes a gated community. And you don't get in unless you can pay the rent or avoid offending the people who built the gate in the first place. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If Nintendo wins against Pocket Pair, the floodgates open for more cases targeting gameplay mechanics. If Sony wins against Tencent, those gates open for cases targeting entire aesthetic identities. And if both win, that's the perfect storm. We're looking at an industry where every major publisher has their lawyers on speed dial, ready to protect their mechanics, themes, and vibes. That's not an industry that encourages innovation. That's an industry that encourages sameness, safe bets, predictable sequels, endless remakes. The stuff that's easiest to protect in court is also the stuff that's easiest to sell without taking risks. And the games that push boundaries, they become legal liabilities instead of creative triumphs. And this isn't just a developer problem. Players lose too. Because the next great game you didn't know you needed, the one that comes out of nowhere and changes how you think about a genre, probably doesn't get made in that world. The pitch meeting dies before it even starts. The prototype never leaves the dev's hard drive. And all you're left with is the same safe, familiar stuff you've already played 100 times. The most frustrating part? None of this is inevitable. Courts have historically been reluctant to give blanket protection to gameplay mechanics or broad aesthetics. The legal standard for copyright has always been about protecting specific expressions, not general ideas. But standards can shift. All it takes is one or two high-profile wins to embolden other publishers to test the limits. That's why these cases matter so much more than the individual games involved. Whether you love or hate Poworld, whether you think Light of Motum looks like a shameless Horizon clone, or just a cool new IP, the outcome of these lawsuits will ripple out far beyond their own worlds. If Nintendo wins, it sends a message to every small developer: stay away from our genres, or you're next. If Sony wins, it tells the entire industry, careful how your game looks and feel, because vibe theft might now be a thing you can get sued over. The best case scenario? Both companies lose, and the courts reaffirm that inspiration is fair game as long as you're not copying code, art, or assets outright. That would send the opposite message, that you can compete, iterate, and improve on existing formulas without living in fear of being dragged into court. But let's be realistic. No matter what happens here, this isn't the end of the story. Even if both lawsuits fail, big publishers will keep looking for ways to protect their turf. They'll experiment with different legal arguments, try different jurisdictions, and yes, pick different targets, especially ones less capable of fighting back. That's why the bigger fight isn't in the courtroom. It's in the culture of the industry itself. Developers need to keep talking about these cases. Players need to pay attention, because it's not just about one game. It's about the kind of games we'll have 5 or 10 years from now. And journalists, critics, and influencers need to keep asking the question, is this really about protecting creativity, or is it about controlling it? Because once control becomes the goal, creativity becomes collateral damage, and that's not a gaming future worth defending. And so here's the closing thought I want to leave you with. Every time you play a game you love, ask yourself what came before it. The games it borrowed from, the mechanics it refined, the risks it took that might not have been possible if someone had locked down those ideas. Now imagine if those games had been sued out of existence before they even launched. That's the reality we're flirting with right now. And if we let these lawsuits set the rules, the next wave of greats might never even make it to our hands. Inspiration built this industry. If we let fear and litigation replace it, we're not protecting gaming. We're suffocating it.